Okay, let's do this. All right. So I haven't talked a lot about the whole Epstein thing because I just haven't wanted to give it as much attention as a lot of other people just feel. Um they just feel sucked into this kind of stuff, and they just, they want to give it all, give it all this attention. And I'm not sure that it necessarily deserves a lot of the attention that a lot of people want to give it. On the other hand, I do think it's important, and I do think that we should pay some attention to it. So, for the last couple of years, since the world kind of learned who this dude supposedly was, um, I've had kind of these two thoughts on it that are somewhat in tension. On the one hand, it's like, okay, I think that this is an op, and I do believe, I've always believed that this whole thing was an op. But on the other hand, I also still think we should care. So the way that I kind of reconcile those two thoughts that are somewhat in tension with one another, which is, do we pay attention to this or do we not pay attention to this? And on the one hand, I say, yeah, we should. And on the other hand, I say, yeah, no, we shouldn't. So the way that I kind of reconcile those two somewhat competing thoughts is that I kind of draw a distinction between Epstein, the guy, and then the Epstein op, which I think is far more important, because regardless of what we think about this supposed dude, named Epstein, and this supposed list and these activities, linked to him, regardless of what we think about that or whatever, or regardless of whether or not that dude, even if he never existed, those types of activities do go on. They occur to a much greater degree than we're allowed to know about. And they involve a lot of influential people that are in positions of power. So that's what I'm talking about, kind of the Epstein op and Epstein type activities. That understanding that and that stuff happens is much more important than this supposed dude and what supposedly he was or was not involved in. So anyway, that's probably a little bit confusing. But I do want to read something that I wrote and put out just recently about this. And so, yeah, it's a piece that I put out on my Substack, and I called it Epstein the Lightning Rod. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read it. It's not that long. And I'll give you some of my commentary along the way. This is not some sort of in depth analysis to Epstein. There are people who've covered this a lot more than I have or will. But anyway, I'll share some thoughts. So, Epstein the Lightning Rod, I'm reading now from my piece. I wanted to share a few quick thoughts on Jeffrey Epstein, the types of activities forever linked to his name, and the massive amounts of attention centered on him. This is not meant to be an exhaustive exploration into Epstein or the allegations that have circulated about him and those in his circles over the past 5 years. I just have a few thoughts I wanted to share. I don't claim to have any special knowledge regarding Epstein. In fact, there are many folks out there who have researched him far more than I have. I also can't say to have firsthand knowledge of the world he has operated within, though it doesn't take much imagination or research to grasp the dark nexus that lies at the intersection of intelligence operations, political blackmail, and the most extreme forms of sexual depravity. Epstein appears to have been involved in a very sick world. Let me share the first portion of a Twitter or X post that I put out a few months ago on February 28th, 2025. And then I put a screenshot of the first part of the post. The post is a little bit long, too long to put in a single screenshot. But I put the first couple paragraphs of it in the screenshot that's in this Substack, and then I go ahead and I cite the text. I have the entirety of the text from that post that's in the Substack as well. So I'll read that to you, because this whole Substack post is kind of a little bit of an expansion of this Twitter post that I wrote back in February. So anyway, the entirety of that Twitter post can be read below. Now, remember, This Twitter post was written in February. Okay, so 5 months ago, and I'll just go ahead and tell you, spoiler alert, my thoughts haven't really changed a lot despite all the stuff that has come out recently about this. But anyway, back to the reading. So this is what I put in the Twitter post, February 28th. I wrote me during the entire Epstein op, and then I put the yawn emoji. Why? Because it's an op. It was always an op. It continues to be an op. It's so much of an op that the idea that it's an op is also an op. Smiley face, or actually sunglasses dude emoji, and then I put in parentheses because it's multi-layered. So I'm being a little bit funny there, but not really. I mean, I do think that it is that layered, right? That's not to say that Epstein-like crimes don't occur. They certainly do, and are far worse than we've been allowed to know. But the exposure story was deliberate, controlled, and limited. That continues to be the case. My thoughts for years have been that Epstein isn't dead. The "he didn't kill himself" meme was so prevalent and pervasive that it was obvious to anyone who had eyes to see that they wanted you to think that not only was he dead, but also that he'd been killed to keep him from revealing whatever he knew. The official story that he killed himself was so intentionally laughable that you were supposed to reject it and therefore cling to the alternate narrative that he'd been offed. Many Americans dutifully rejected the primary narrative of suicide and thus bought the alternate narrative of murder, which is exactly what they wanted you to do the whole time. That's how sophisticated psyops work. Pause. So if you're not familiar with what I've written or what I've said about complex psyops, go check out my video called Complex Psyops. And it kind of talks about these competing narratives, etc. All right, back to reading. Also, did Epstein himself ever exist at all? Was or is he a real person? Is he a composite of multiple people? Is he merely an avatar meant to represent or push ideas they want to seed in our minds? And then I put in parentheses, like Elon is, in my view. Also, let me pause right there. So I think that's quite plausible that Jeffrey Epstein, the guy, didn't necessarily exist in the way that they want us to think that he existed. I'm not necessarily saying that's the case. I'm saying that if we were to find out that that's true, that would not shock me at all. I think that's a very plausible option. It's not the one that I necessarily think is most likely. I would tend to say what's most likely is, of the four options, right? He killed himself, he was killed, he's still alive, or he never existed at all. The one that I kind of tend to focus on is he's probably a real person that is still alive. But I think the next most likely is that he never existed at all, at least in the way that we're supposed to believe that he existed. But I'm not necessarily saying that that's what I believe. But yeah, I do find that a very plausible option. I know that there are people out there that think he never existed. I don't think that's a crazy idea. All right, back to the reading. Again, the Epstein type stories are very real and far short of the whole truth. However, the clown show drama that's been going on for 5+ years is intentionally theatrical and meant to be a mockery of these sick activities and public naivete about them. We haven't learned about these stories despite the best efforts of the deep state to cover them up, but precisely because the deep state has chosen to reveal what they have. If anyone does, in fact, end up prosecuted over all of this, it's because that too was intended. We've got to stop falling for obvious psyops and assuming they represent victories. Okay, so that is my post that I put out 5 months ago. And obviously, so much more has come out in the last couple of weeks, just in general attention that is being focused on Epstein. Okay, so back to the Substack post. That post, meaning the Twitter post from 5 months ago, still sums up what I think of Epstein and the op built around him. Over the past few months, since I made that Twitter post, much more attention has become focused on Epstein and Epstein type activities, but my overall assessment has not changed. In fact, the assessment hinges on one critical assumption, which I laid out clearly above. We only know about Epstein because the deep state has permitted us to know about him and the things he was involved in. All right, and then I put in here, quick note on the deep state. I used to shy away from using the term deep state, but have since gone back to using it more frequently. I realized that my resistance was more to the incorrect way the term was being used than it was to the term itself. And then I put a link here, see here for a brief but thorough explanation of the history of the use of the term, and it'll take you to an article that will talk about it. I put that article in other things that I've written. Another reason I've gone back to using it more is because the term is already in common use and therefore easily understood, though it is important to ensure the proper meaning is conveyed. That's just me. Quick note there about my use of the term deep state. Anyway. All right, so back to what I was saying about Epstein and how the deep state, we only know about this whole situation because the deep state has allowed us to know. That means that the entire situation, to include the exposure of Epstein type activities, is an op. It was planned, and the plan is now being carried out. If it was planned to be carried out this way, then it must be because all of this serves a purpose for the deep state. Epstein functions as a lightning rod. In other words, he is there to intentionally catch the hyper-focused array of heat, light, and energy that is sure to come. A lightning rod's function is to protect structures from possible lightning strikes by providing an alternate, lower resistance path to the ground. Unfortunately, it's often a human tendency to follow the path of least resistance. And this holds true with how most people respond to the information they encounter. All right, what do I mean by that? Pause. Well, you end up believing what is less costly, whatever is less costly for you to believe, less costly to your paradigm, or less costly to your career, or how you make money, or what people will think of you, your reputation, etc. Even when you think you're not doing that, a lot of times you may be choosing the path of least resistance, but you may find other ways to conveniently convince yourself that's not what you're doing. And this is a human tendency, and we all struggle with this. I'm not saying that I mean, we all struggle with finding ways to convince ourselves that something is true, or that we should do something, do this as opposed to this, like that's just part of knowing yourself and knowing your own weaknesses, and understanding when you sometimes may be deceiving yourself, because that's quite common. We have to learn to be able to see through that, Anyway. All right, so this role as a lightning rod achieves two possible objectives. One, it serves to reveal to the public that these types of activities occur while still concealing the scope of their occurrence. All right, so it's a reveal/conceal op, meaning you reveal to the public that this is happening, but you conceal the degree to which it's happening. That's number one. Number two, it reinforces a false idea of the deep state. So child trafficking is no longer a secret in this country. Many Americans care about this topic, as they should, and can't countenance the fact that the worst possible crimes are either directly committed or otherwise enabled by those in government. Therefore, this understandable ire must be directed at someone. Epstein and his supposed list provide a convenient outlet. Permitting Americans to train their anger on Epstein serves this intended goal of revealing that these actions happen while still concealing the extent to which these revelations occur. I think I actually meant concealing the extent to which these actions occur. I need to go back and change that word. Why would the deep state want people to know that these horrible actions are being committed by powerful people in positions of influence? As I have mentioned before, Many of those who control the deep state operate along the occult principle of consent farming. To understand this, we must realize that these dark individuals engage in ritual activity. The effectiveness of these rituals, according to these individuals, can be increased by gaining the consent of those targeted in the ritual. This involves revealing, though perhaps not explicitly or completely, what it is that they are doing. Our inability to stop them equates in their minds to consent. How does the Epstein narrative reinforce an inaccurate or incomplete idea of the deep state? Again, let me address the point I briefly mentioned above. It is important to understand the distinction between the originally intended use of the term deep state and the less complete meaning of the term after its deliberate hijacking. For a more in-depth look at the history of the term, see this article here. It's the same one that I posted above as well. Go find that article. I've also spoken more in depth about this in a video here, and then I include a video in which I go into the deep state and the history of the term. It originally comes from Turkey. It was popularized in the West, in the United States and other Western nations to describe other types of kind of this nexus between organized crime and the government and an intelligence apparatus. It could even be expanded to include secret societies, etc. But that kind of understanding of the deep state to describe, Western societies, that popularization was done by Professor Peter Dale Scott, but he's borrowing the term that was already in use in Turkey. But anyway, go find the video that I did on that. My goal is not to give a thorough explanation of the deep state here in this Substack. So what are the false ideas of the deep state that the Epstein op reinforces? The term deep state really started to be used during the 2016 presidential campaign to a far broader degree than it had been used before. However, the way the term was used led many people to become confused as to what the deep state is. Use of the term by Trump and others in his orbit reinforced the idea that the deep state is a Democrat phenomenon. This is, of course, ridiculous. The deep state controls both political parties and certainly controls all recent presidents. This point is important. This is why the Epstein file, assuming it exists and is as damning as we've been told, was never released by the Democrats while Biden was in office. Some suggest that Trump must not be in the Epstein file because his inclusion in the file would have resulted in exposure by his enemies when they had the power to do so. Those pushing this idea are merely revealing their inability to comprehend how the deep state works. What I'm talking about here is like those who say, oh, if Trump was in the Epstein file, the Democrats would have already revealed it, And what I'm saying is, you don't know how the deep state works. And you don't know that Trump is an asset of the deep state. All right, so now I'm going to explain a little bit of that. And this is kind of the last part of this Substack post. The influence operation used to build Trump up in the eyes of conservatives over the past decade has included several specific active measures. One of these has been deliberate attacks by the media, the Democrats, or even some rhinos. The objective is that by portraying Trump as having the right enemies, conservatives would incorrectly conclude that he must be a champion of liberty. Other efforts included the spurious indictments, the Mar-a-Lago raids, and then the capstone event, the staged assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania in July of 2024. Before the Butler event, which yielded the fight, fight, fight photo, there was the Trump mugshot. These images are important parts of the influence operation. If he's consistently attacked by the deep state, he must be an opponent. He must be an opponent of the deep state, right? Wrong, but that is what you're supposed to think. A sophisticated influence operation of this type must involve attacks that are powerful enough to build the credibility of the subject, but not so powerful that they irreparably damage his reputation. I'm going to repeat that. A sophisticated influence operation of this type must involve attacks that are powerful enough to build the credibility of the subject, but not so powerful that they irreparably damage his reputation. So the left has to attack him. The media has to attack him. Why? Because if you have the right enemies, it makes you look like a good guy because you're the opponent of those enemies, right? But they can't be so powerful or so damaging that they destroy your reputation or your credibility altogether. So you can accuse him of certain things, but you can't accuse him of crimes that are too much. You can't accuse him of pedophilia because that would damage his reputation. That's what I'm getting at. The CIA and other intelligence networks certainly know this. Think about the influence operations that would be used to meddle in a foreign election. Agency operatives could deliberately run an influence operation to build the credibility of the friendly pro-US candidate while simultaneously delegitimizing a rival candidate. The Epstein files release under Biden would have resulted in too powerful a blow to Trump before the deep state was done using him. That's why it would not have been used against him by the Democrats. That would not have been permitted. If the Epstein file is used to destroy Trump or anyone, then it's because that's intended. It would mean Trump has fulfilled his role and has either been betrayed and discarded by those who own and control him, which does occasionally happen, or perhaps it would mean that even this downfall, his downfall has been faked. That could happen too. Whatever happens, Epstein is a lightning rod that serves the purposes of the deep state and does not in any way mean that the deep state is losing control. The true power players are at no risk. This, of course, doesn't mean we shouldn't care about Epstein. It should deeply concern us that those running our country are likely involved in the most sinister deeds a human can commit. That should deeply trouble us. Our country is at stake, but we shouldn't assume the Epstein op is something it isn't. Okay, so that's my piece that I wrote, kind of short. So again, I draw a clear distinction between Epstein the guy, whether he's dead, whether he's not, whether he ever existed at all, whatever, and then kind of the Epstein op. Okay, so recognize the op for what it is. Don't get sucked into it. Is there a list? I don't know. I have no idea. Is there a list? Is it going to come out? Who's going to be on it? I have no idea. But if it comes out, then it's because that was intended. And whoever goes down, that was intended by the deep state. Epstein and the Epstein list is of it poses zero risk. It poses zero risk to the deep state and those at the top of the totem pole. Is the U.S. president at the top of the totem pole of the deep state? No. He is an asset of the deep state. I wouldn't say he's a puppet. I mean, there's kind of a difference between a puppet and an asset. I think he's more than a puppet, but he does do what he's told. He does follow orders. He does not give orders. He may give some orders to his staff, members of his cabinet, but in the grand scheme of things, the U.S. president takes orders from those who own and control him. Whether it's Trump, whether it's Biden, whether it's Obama, whether it's the Bushes, the Clintons, they take orders. Okay. And we're talking about presidents here, but it would be the same thing if we're talking about other team members in government as well. I'm just talking about presidents because there's this idea that, the president is the leader of the free world. Well, that's not really true. It's not true at all. So is there a list? I have no idea. Is the list going to come out? I have no idea. If it comes out, that's because that's what the deep state has decided to do. And whoever goes down, they go down. That was intended. If it doesn't come out, then it means there was never a list. And this is all just, being dangled out there so people kind of latch onto it. I don't know if there's a list. I have no idea. but I do know that this is all a deep state op. So let's not get wrapped up in thinking that this is something that it isn't. Is this an op? Yes. Okay. Should that be obvious? Yes. Yes, it should be obvious. We got to start recognizing these psyops for what they are. Okay. That said, yes, we should care that our government is run by extremely sinister individuals engaged in the worst type of activities that you could be engaged in. That should bother us. The soul of our nation is at stake, to kind of say it like that. I do, I think that's where we are. And also, you got to remember when you look at the whole what these activities are, that the types of activities that are linked to Epstein and Epstein Island. So um it's the people who engage in those types of activities. It's not just that they are perverts. Now they are, but that's not the full explanation as to why they engage in these activities. They engage in these activities because they're rituals. It's even worse than just the perversion associated with that. It's much deeper than that. It's that these are the darkest type. These activities are parts of the darkest type of rituals that one can even imagine, and probably far exceed our ability to even uh, imagine what they are. And I don't pretend to know what the full extent of those activities are, but I do know that they're rituals, and I know that they're the deepest, most evil type of rituals done by the deepest, most evil type of people that I'm sure are in communion with demonic forces when conducting these rituals. I truly believe that 100%. And those are the forces that are in control of this country. And so if you are someone who believes that, again, I'm not talking about this list that may or may not exist, about this guy that we may or may not know the truth about. I'm talking about these activities. If you are someone who does not believe that these activities conducted by people who are in the highest positions in our government, because I believe that they are involved in these types of activities. And I believe that that is an existential threat to our country's existence. I do. Now, who do I think is involved in this stuff? I don't know. I mean, I can hazard a guess, and I think there would be some evidence to support what I would say, but I mean, I don't know for sure. And I don't necessarily have the type of evidence that I would use to pose a court case. Okay, I'm telling you what I think. It would be my opinion, but it would be my opinion based on the way that I see things, and it would also be based on some evidence that I think is out there. So, do I think that presidents are involved in these types of activities? Yeah, I think that's very, very likely. Okay. Can I prove it about any one specific president? No. Are there people out there who have made accusations that I think um, may hold some water? And some of these accusations have been made against various presidents. Yeah, I think that evidence is out there. Now, you can draw your own conclusions as to whether or not they hold water, or you could, decide whether or not you think it. Again, I'm not making a legal case here, so I'm kind of rambling, but I'm not making a legal case. What I'm saying is, I do think that there is evidence to suggest that very powerful people in our government are involved in the worst type of activities. Now, why? Is it because they're pervert? Yeah, but it goes just so much further than that. Okay, so much darker than just that, and that's pretty dark. Um, is it for control file purposes? Yes, I do believe that it is for control file purposes. So if you're putting someone in a position of influence, a position of power, what's a control file? Well, it's a file you have on them, proof that they've been involved in, certain activities or whatever. And then you use that to ensure that they do what they're supposed to do in that position. And if they ever step out of line, then you have this evidence that you could immediately use to destroy them, ensure they're incarcerated or whatever, right? That's a control file. Well, nowadays, just because of the decadence of our society, no one in 2025 cares about whether or not a president has cheated on his wife or cheated on an ex-wife when he was married to her or whatever. I mean, I say no one cares about that, but like not enough Americans care about that. We're too degraded as a society now. Nobody bats an eye at that. Okay. So if you wanted to have a file that exerted sufficient control on someone in a position of power, you would have to have evidence that was weightier than evidence of an affair. Now, and this evidence could also be contrived. I mean, don't get me wrong. But I think in a lot of cases it's not. The evidence is probably accurate. So do I think that they probably have control files on very powerful people? Yes. But I also think that the ritual aspect is also fundamentally important. Okay. Is it because they're perverts? Yes. Is it because they have to engage in these activities so that there's a control file in order for them to be put in these positions? Yes. But I don't even think that that's the most fundamental reason. I think the most fundamental reason is the deep state, which itself is just a vassal or a colony of the deep empire, which I think controls, most of the world and world leaders. For you to be kind of part of that club and for them then to put you in these positions, they're only going to do that if you are in fact part of the club and you've been involved in a lot of this deep, dark stuff. So if you still believe that, elections are legitimate or whatever, then this is probably going to be lost on you. But if you realize that there are people in control, and they're pulling the strings from, well hidden behind the curtain, well hidden in the shadows, then yeah, that's kind of what I think is the play here. So I don't know if I explained myself super well, probably rambling a little bit, but hopefully that made some sense to you. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Is there a list? I don't know. Who's on the list? I don't know. But do I think that people at the top are involved in these types of activities? Yeah, I would assume so. Can I prove that do I have substantial evidence that I, Brad Miller, could put into a legal brief that would hold up in court? No, I'm not saying that at all. But that doesn't mean that it also doesn't mean that I think that there's zero evidence to support my personal opinion that, yeah, they're involved in this type of stuff. So anyway, all right. I feel like I'm repeating myself, so probably a good time to just go ahead and close out the video. All right. Hey, thanks, you guys. Appreciate it. And like and share. See you next time.